Welcome everybody. Today we're going to do a panel that's about translation and the synchronicity between translators and people they translate. It could be a causal connection, it could be a mimetic connection, yeah? And so let's just begin. Should we go, which order? Should we go to alphabetical order? That would put you last. That would put you first, me second, and Gunnar third. Yeah? All right.
I guess I have no choice. Thank you, Gabe, for that.
You're very welcome.
One of those. I'm just going to put so can you hear me? Yeah. So my work, I'm a translator and I'm also a poet, and today I'm going to read a little bit of both because I work on everything at the same time. So the translation projects and my writing projects are connected. So for example, when I was translating the Brazilian author Ildailshi and this book of Death Minimal Odes, it's about time, and it challenges heteronormative patriarchal conceptions and of time and gender. So I'll read one poem from here and in Portuguese so you'll get a feel of what it sounds like. 32. Por que me fiz poeta? Porque tu, morte minha irmã, no instante, no centro de tudo que vejo, no mais que perfeito, no veio, no gozo, colada entre mim e o outro, no fosso, no nó de ínfimo laço, no hausto, no fogo, na minha hora fria. Me fiz poeta porque a minha volta, na humana ideia de Deus que não conheço, a ti, morte, minha irmã, te vejo. And my version of that is 32. Why did I become a poet? Because you, death, my sister, in the instant, at the core of everything I see, in what is more than perfect, in the trickle, in pleasure, pressed between me and the other, in the ditch, in the knot of minute tie, in a mouthful, in the fire, in my cold hour, I became a poet because around me, in the human idea of a God I don't know, you, death, my sister, I see. So I was still thinking about time after that, so I wrote this chapbook, Time, Tempo, the idea of breath. And tempo is, in English, is rhythm, right? So it's already talking about time in a way, but also tempo is in Portuguese, it means time. So I was connecting it to that, but also this is how I inhabit the world, right? So here's my take on time. And basically what I'm doing here in this book is challenging inhabiting time and conceptualizing time as one and taking for granted that there's only one way of doing it. One word at a time, make it a long time. Knowing languages is staying in one word enough to enjoy its buds, swelling into abundance and realize that spring spreads sideways and always tears us a little. Knowing one word is not enough to understand, even if the word is many, even if many means you're referring to something countable, ditch capitalism. Knowing is so flexible anyway, like what's remembered can challenge into a dream, into what happened and maybe forgotten. Sometimes you sleep for 12 hours and sometimes you sleep 12 hours and are left wondering why you respond to such numbers. Does linger already have what I appreciate in slowness? To add what can multiply or subtract? There is no formula to pin down wisdom, but in stopping, consider the word again to reformulate indifference in variations. So then the next pair is I translated Klaus and the Scorpion by Dara do Passo Ruibal from the Galician, and this is a book that is talking about a world very much like our own, very violent, very oppressive. There's no respite. It's a world that yeah, doesn't let us breathe or be creative. And again, I'm gonna read just a little bit in Galician, so you hear what it sounds like in a Uruguayan accent, and then I'll read the translation version, and you'll see. I think in a nutshell, you'll see what this book is about. Os insectos existen, quero dizer, son reais, e eu também sou real. E o despertador às 7 da manhã, as vendas vermelhas nos pulsos, existe o teléfono que quase não soa, e uma cama enorme azul. There are insects, I mean, they're real, and I too am real, and the alarm clock at 7 in the morning, the red bandages on my wrists. There's a phone that hardly rings in an enormous blue bed. There are books that I'll burn one day before losing my head. There are endless notebooks and a lack of interest in opening them. All of me, endless pain, bleeding for no apparent reason while it rains outside because water is purifying even if it never stops raining. There are holes in my irises, words, all of them, even those I don't know, that make the sky's map. And there's the sky as I read books that I'll never fully know, on my enormous and lonely bed behind the window that shatters into pieces onto the street. I wait for the street to shatter into pieces onto her down below, to be able to squeeze her one last time, but to have at least that one last time, and then the pressure, the fast rhythm. Then the blows with my fists against the wind like a dance, but other lines that aren't these lines, and my scant interest in releasing them into other languages, so mine that I don't speak them. There are insects and they speak those languages. They linger over those bodies in silence because they own everything they touch. And I, constantly giving birth to maggots, I, present at the birth of hair on my eyebrows, my forehead, my legs, a hair that grows with no strength as I strike with my bandaged wrists and break the words with my blows, in that scant interest in keeping them intact. They say poetry, and I strike. They put a mirror, and I strike so hard that I lose my vision. At 7 in the morning, I lose my vision. At night, I sharpen my ears, but I lose my vision in this sterility of the everyday, without energy to do anything else but strike the wind and feel the futility, the blindness. The insects crawl like slugs. I exist because they're real. The insects, their names, Klaus, also exist. He's also real. Lying on the bed, his open chest, his heart hanging from the walls, repeated more than 30 times, his metallic heart stirred by the wind. The whole ceiling is a mirror. Klaus looks at himself in that mirror. When I get there at night, he takes my hand so that I recognize the seams. His open chest widens as I run my fingers over it. The blue bed is enormous and blue. The insects climb the walls and linger over our hearts. They linger, and I feel them breathing. So in this book, interspersed with these long poems, there are shorter poems, and they work as respites in an otherwise book that will make you feel trapped. And then there's this concept of a safe haven. So I was thinking of, what is my safe haven? What is my home, given that I am from Uruguay, have lived in Israel, lived in several places in the US, that I think in Spanish and I operate in English here, that, Celsius, Fahrenheit, different hemispheres. And I wrote this chapbook, and my answer to that is basically, my answer to where is my home is in language. Uprooting. I was going to text you first thing in the morning, but I don't want my first words to be about interruptions and losing sleep, losing thoughts, getting lost. Noises are kicking me out of sleep. The word home and what it means, the womb. It's harder to hear certain words. They need attention and a different verb. Listen is always paired with being careful, full of care. During these noisy nights, I'm careful as a synonym for guarded, and I can only return to going away. So I think I have 1 more minute left, so I'm going to read a very short poem from the current project, which is Sardine by Miriam Reyes. And here in this book, she's struggling with coming back to Galician after being an immigrant in Venezuela, So it's the struggle to own your culture and your language and what that means. Non quero aprender a chamar as coisas pelo seu nome, nesta língua, quero chamá-las pelo seu significado. My translation is, I don't want to learn to call things by their name in this tongue. I want to call them by their meaning. And this is what I'm exploring in this new manuscript about the meaning of the languages I inhabit. Coming to terms, peeling a tangerine slowly, calling it mandarina because I need the extra syllable to take time to touch the peel, feel it orange in my hands, rip it apart. How different things are when we open them, how we do it. I look for another word that will lead me in without violence. Mandarina. Unfurl and release. Let go of force. Mandarina. Let the opening up happen of its own accord. Offer the hand, the rind on the plate, sometimes curling, sometimes many hint of what it used to be. A word as a contract with all of its letters. Thank you.
It was beautiful.
Really?
I want to speak a little bit about Gunnar Varnas's poems. This is Gunnar Varnas. These are his poems. And he's got several others. At one point when I was translating this book, Gunnar said something to me, and maybe he was just being nice, but he said, I don't know why that would be nice to say, but he said at one point, you're the perfect person to translate this book. And I was like, oh, that's so nice, and it made me feel good, and I know it was probably encouragement. But in some ways, as I began to read this work, I realized that there were many resonances, and one of the resonances is the way that Gunnar writes what I call the katabatic journey, the journey into the underworld. There's something Gunnar does very well in this book, and it's the writing of the dead, and the conjunction between the dead and disembodied voices and disembodied spirit and language. That connection is somehow very, very compelling. Language is obviously an enfleshed and embodied thing at the same time that it's not. And there's some discord, disconnect, but vitality there that I think is very compelling. And so I want to start by reading Gunnar's poem, Die Dödes Business, the business of the dead. Today I have seen a flattened snake on the road. I have startled a hare. I have seen a half-drunk box of cola light standing alone in the forest. Have emptied an empty mailbox and thought, have opened an empty mailbox and thought, this is just a bunch of naked events. These don't happen to me in order to become meaningful. Rather, I am so empty that in order to have meaning, they come to me in order to happen. In this way, things are begging to be created. In the ears of the smith, the sledges keep ringing. Behind the eyelids of the driver, snow keeps falling. The sound hangs in the bell. Newsprint blackens fingers, and like that, the dead remain here on earth, a kind of children who have disappeared back into us. No one is as close to us as the dead, but we try anyway to call them back. We speak so much of them that even the earth we throw in their faces isn't sufficient to hide them. We talk so much about the dead that the kids who play on the kitchen floor play dead to get our attention. And the dead play too. At this very moment they continue to bury each other those massacred in schools bury under their own bodies the naked bodies of the mass incarcerated who died in prisons. The dead murdered by the police bury the suicide bombed with their own bodies. The missing dead spread the ashes from burned discotheques over the wreckage of factory ceiling collapses. Mall bombs, turnpike pile-ups. They eat one another's faces and no longer answer when we call to them. The word horse wants to run with the horse. The word hare wants to sit with the hare. The word death belongs to the living. The word loss is searching for the missing. The word crazy runs from the cracked. The word expensive is cheap and available to all. The word free is cheap and available to all. Such are words, cheap, available to all. I am cheap and ordinary and available to all. I am cheap and ordinary and I want to be with those I love. I am cheap and ordinary and I write about language, that angry, crackling shroud inside which the words are hiding. I put it on. I look like shit. Sentences pull the guts out of the carcass that is the world. Slick membranes slumped on its body. Glossy slices of syntax and context hang in context and syntax. Alarmed, I stuff the intestines back inside and I boil myself and the dead in my empty eye sockets. The steam is coming out of my ears. I am the needle, the syntax, the thread, stitching together loosely the language carcass that is begging me to put the silk-thin language over the body. And I do it. And the carcass says, look, the silk shroud of language takes its shape from the face of the body beneath it. And I do it. I put it on. Look, it's not a human being any longer. It's an empty shroud. Now I'd like you to sew a human being from it. And I do it. It looks like a ghoul. Are you a ghost? No, I'm just like you. Why have you made me like this? I don't want to be like this. Some time ago I wrote this book in my car as I was driving between a state in which I was living and a state 1,100 miles away, 18 hours drive, in which my daughter was living. And I described the drive to her as an analysis, a march up country, and the drive back home, a catabasis, a retreat into the land of the dead, which I felt like living away from my daughter for that long. And as I was riding in my car, I would find that as I drove back home, back west, I would feel increasingly dead. And it was a very, very disconcerting time. And so this is a bit of a comment, sort of a bit of language from that drive in which I began to feel more and more like empty meat and dead. There is very little meat on the human ear. Head of the beetle will never wear a helmet. The other day, walking back inside from the rain, the smell of the books was overwhelming. My head was formed in library, my hope there. And I've always loved meeting librarians. May they always be my friends. They're like surrogate aunts, uncles. There is no job more maternal. Today my armpits smell of chicken soup. They smell like someone had lifted up my arm and found a second mouth in my armpit. At first it appeared like a small vulva, but parting the lips I soon discovered an assembly of teeth, a live tongue, a second throat descending into the torso. And there, in lippy nest, was an eruption of pustules and hay-colored cankers and a large blonde gumboil supporting a flaccid bleb bulb bag of pus. The whole arrangement was festooned in crimpled hair. This relationship feels like playing racquetball on top of a kite. Sometimes in our arguments, minutes after minutes kind of wreck themselves against the clock. Sometimes I have seen the clouds. Often some of them wrestle with the more awkward treetops. Ronald Reagan, that thick, melodious optimist, has given way to a daft, malevolent paranoid. Susquehanna River, 335 miles, 12:05 p.m. Eastern. And time, 8 minutes in, okay, 4 minutes left. I'm going to read a poem that I wrote about a fetus. This book is full of disembodied voices, and one of them is a baby, a fetus, speaking from a bonfire in the middle of a fire. And that's another thing that I really love and admire about Gunnar's poetry, is the way that he will evoke I'm not sure, the way that voice moves throughout all beings and all things that could be construed as having being. And so this is a poem that was written after Texas State Bill something, which outlawed any abortion and describes the fetus. In the bill, it actually crosses out the word fetus, crosses it out, and puts the word person in there. And that's in the Texas State Bill. It's very spooky and icky. So in this poem, I give life, I give personhood to the fetus. And it's called To That One Figure in Bruegel, written by a fetus, and it's not long. They say we are much improved by small bruises, though nothing's changed you so much as the fact that you cannot be helped. We watch the tongue arrive above you, rich and plump as a gland returning its lips unused. It is a zeppelin, a splinter bursts it, and she smears away across the sky. This is an old version of this poem, this is terrible. I'm gonna read it anyway.
Don't trust your phone.
Right? This is terrible. I'm just going to read it.
So you said.
A splinter bursts, yeah, right. Eventually, I will finish it. A splinter bursts it, and she smears away across the sky. Someone's fetus rides her, perhaps it's yours. By the fetus who rides her, but the fetus who rides her has blown its own bladder out of its urethra, playing it like lowland pipes, celebrating itself as a petty robot and a freak for sauce. Out of its sizeless ass, the lighthouse bulbs of the world fall as eggs. Your body is the luggage for your disaster. That in the branches of your machinedom, your body is a mobile tree of levers used for filling holes and holding the piles of the cooked. Your body is for the hauling of itself past fire, where its hair would wick, for the hauling of itself from the flumes of the deluge and the piling of its own limbs in beds. How old and funny and busy the sea at the side of the painting, all its fins in the underwater, its seasides quaint and clabbered where, except for murder and theft, little crime. And even there the crime's mere custom, for which justice be in all that damp and salty meat. Even the rich collected threads in the ribboned fields. The light rests in the bridge footing. It shines in your basket. This is the spring in all its clatter and art. And if instead of weather vanes, there are chandeliers mounted on the barns, each bouquet of light salutes our feasting in the wilderness, and not your Lent and loss.
Thank you, Gabe. My name is Gunnar. I'm Norwegian, and I translate from several languages and cooperate with people knowing the languages. I know poetry. I have translated from Russian. I'm partly entitled to do so because I know Bulgarian, but only partly so. And in 2010, 2011, I translated the Russian poet Velimir Klevnikov, together with one of my colleagues called Mikael Nydal. And Velimir Klevnikov, he was born in 1885, so he had his young years he spent in he grew up in the tension that led up to the Russian Revolution, that led up to the First World War. And it was a time of turmoil and a troubled time into which he engaged 100% as a political being. And also he invested a lot of his hopes in the changes that were to come through the revolution. And I'm latching onto the theme of this talk, that is how you employ the things you pick up when you translate from another language. And I have been stealing like a raven from Velimir Klevnikov, so that's the reason I want to mention him here and talk a little bit about his poem. And in 1921, Klevnikov had been on the run from conscription for almost 2 years. He had voluntarily committed himself to an insane asylum to get away from conscription, and he was a haunted and wanted person. And the future he had hoped for, that would materialize with the communist revolution, turned into a brutal and long civil war that probably never ended. But in 1921 he wrote a poem called The Sledgehammer, which made a huge impression on me. It's not translated into English, I noticed to my surprise, even if most of his works are translated into English. This particular poem isn't. I don't know why, but I made an ad hoc translation in the hotel, so I will relate a couple of lines from this poem so you know what it is about. And it's called The Sledgehammer. The strokes of the sledgehammer against the ocean's grave, against the mermaid's hills, across the vertebrae of stones, across the copper's fingers, across the rocky craters, against the spine of the dried out deluge, where the petrified mermaids squint, where rages a storm of petrified goddesses. And this is how the poem goes on. It's a long poem in an epic form. It's a sort of mock epic. The rhythm is increasing all the time. So it starts like da, 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 da. So it builds a sort of rhythmical tower that is not stable, and the poem is constantly on the verge of falling apart. And it's a monstrous poem, something like a black metal poem, if you can imagine such a thing being created in the form of an epic. It's a terrifying imagery that consists of destruction, but it's a destruction that is made out of manufacturing. It's the sledgehammer is shaping the world, but it's shaping the world through crushing of mountains, the breaking of the ocean, and this manufacturing process is like a nightmarish vision of extraction economy and extraction business. And the whole thing is being concentrated in the image, the terrifying image of an anvil made of mermaids' bodies. It's probably the most terrifying simile I've ever heard. It conflates the mass grave and the tool in one single object. And the whole poem ends with a sort of resolution where the sledgehammer begets a child from itself, and that is a child that is, in the last words of the poem, neither he nor she but it, with eyes of iron and a curly mouth of iron. So it's kind of a sweet image also, but it's a giant made of iron looking at you with eyes of iron. So it's sweet and it's terrifying. That was the future that Klemko envisioned when he wrote this poem. And one central trope in this poem is that he extracts words from other words. So the sentence that caught my attention was Is gorlich rut, raditil trut, which means from the mountain's iron ore comes the parent of work. And this is entirely made out of a wordplay. That rut means iron ore, and trut means work, toil, struggle. And he continues to use this trope throughout the poem in the verses Как колос на поле зацвел, через труди страдай руди, труд, рут. So he puts the rhymes right next to each other. It's not musical, it's not pretty. So the line I read to you means like a budding meadow heather. From toil, worry, and ore comes the yoke of ore. So this is how we use wordplay. And as a translator of this poem, I got all sorts of crazy ideas how to transpose this idea into Norwegian. Of course, it's not possible to do so, so I had to answer this abundance of creativity. I had to sort of resolve that by writing another poem. So I wrote a poem called The Wave, where I utilize all the ideas that I got from Klemko. And it's somehow similar, but still different. So I'm not sure if you could call it a cover version or a remix. But it's definitely in-depth, it's very indebted to Klemko. And it comments upon the political situation of 2011. That was in Norway, when Norway was struck by a terrifying act of right-wing terrorism that killed 77 people in one killing spree on an island. And it was also the period that saw the rising and the end of the Occupy Wall Street, which inspired the Occupy Abai movement in Russia, which was brutally struck down and convinced me that Putin's reign could not come to any good. So that was something that became clear to me in 2012-11. So then I wrote this poem called The Wave. The sea made a kid with the wind. It grew up to be a giant. Its body packed with fish, sunken ships, and the giant stood up and threw its body onto the land, and we had to climb into the trees and sit on rooftops just to see where and who and what was floating by on the flood. Butter dish-sized houses, oven-sized schools, bobby pin-sized trees swirling in the face of the beaming child. Do you see the eye spinning in the doll? That eye can't see, can only play at seeing. Do you see an island in the eye? That eye is not like a human being's alone, but it can drown as a human being alone in all that neat cloth, in all those fine faces that you can make with all that neat cloth, all that thick soft face cloth, which rips when you start your crying, in all that thin body cloth, which holds the pressure of the inside that wants out, and the kidneys that are meat live there, and the tears that are water live there, and the spirit lives there, and is tongue and can speak. Look at me. Do you see my head above the water? I'm just an ordinary person now and can swim, but if I dive, I sink and turn into water, but not really ordinary water. I become a water that thirsts, and so have to go ashore just to drink. Flailing, plashing, mammoth, sauroids, bulbous, owl, cow, fowl, mud, bladder, toast, house, packet, cast, rolling toy train. The flood is playing now, piling itself onto a toy island. In dry toy lands, rising again from the waters, branches, bows, sticks, sodden, wicks, solemn, flotsam, tchotchkes, fuel tanks, buses, cars, shells, dogs, doors, all things scattered, loose tongues gone plopping. What will become of this? How could this happen? I wanted to be your kid, and yours too. You long, long tongue, if you could only hear, I just wanted to be somebody's special kid, or the king of everyone. I want to be the eyes tear, to shine and rip, to get in the way, but in this flood we're all being wept by some old spring, wept and wept in the same old brine. It slithers down this cheek, one salty snake, with too many kids. And we can't remember our names, a bouquet of long kids entangled and counting 1 and 2 and many, 1 and 2 and many. Good Lord, so many. I knew we were many, but now we'll all see just how many. And how do I feed them all, now that we are so many?
Hi everyone, I'm Maggie Zarowski. So when Gabe had the idea for this panel, one thing he suggested is the possibility that you found someone to translate that has echoes with your work even before you started translating them or before you knew of them. And last year when I was in Warsaw, a Polish friend of mine was translating a Polish poet into English, and this woman came to my friend's house and found some anthology of Polish prose poetry and said to my friend Gosia, oh, is Marek Mura in that anthology? And she didn't know who he was, and long and short of it, my friend Gosia discovered these prose poems written by one of the soldiers in the Polish underground, that there was an underground poetry press during the war, and a selection, a facsimile of that publication was online, and I started translating it, and I was just very curious about they're all prose poems. The syntax is insane and very difficult to make work in English, but there's one draft that I have that is passable for me to read to you to get a sense of what this work is like. So this is called Father Returns. I crept quietly to open the urn on the chest of drawers, scaring off the premonitions scratching away in the corner. Why had Father been placed here just in front of the tapestry of the Hawaiian girl under a palm, which now in the dark seems to reveal something completely unfamiliar? I had to be careful in case he asked, what are you doing wandering around at night? Sleep. But he's blue for sure now in this can and won't say a thing. And his eyes, bulging and helpless after his glasses were lost, have to be, I think, at the bottom. Yes, in those messages, his letters grew more and more faint, as if they, like ants, wanted to flee their yellow paper. Yes, my father is likely decomposing little by little into this ash, just as his letters decomposed when he wrote, I'm healthy, may God. But back then everything was different. Even smoke from a cigarette would quickly mark the time on windows. The drone of a car turned to dusk and tossed moths small as sparks into the stiff flame of a street lamp. The moment stretched like a rubber band, and I, waiting for it to snap, hugged the wall. When they started beating him in the face, I noticed one of them had a gold tooth and then hugged the wall even tighter. I waited a long, long time for it all to cool into a glass ball no bigger than my palm, one I could place on a shelf and gaze into in the evenings. Now I'm afraid that that moment is lying somewhere blackened, and because it's almost dark, I might step on it. When I dug my hand into the ash, he was almost soft and tasted like soap. Right then I heard the foreign words of a company singing, and the cook started coughing. So I'm going to sort of read my poems to that poem, if that makes any sense. My life in politics. Incapable of limiting themselves to petty offenses, my hands broke into my chest and choked every slumbering deity. After that, I no longer cared to argue about the nature of the flesh, whether powered by vitalist or mechanical forces. The spirits had in either case evaporated as easily as life from the nostrils of a drowned man. Oddly, I did begin to care about numbers, but only in exchangeable forms. Bread, I heard a man say once, and it made me a depressive materialist, not unlike a Franciscan without a dove. I collected frozen peas, greeting each one like a lost friend, then dispersing them in green streams to the hungry mouths in the surrounding counties. At home, I have an old painting to comfort me, a fine example of Impressionism from the Eastern Bloc, circa 1981. In the subtle oranges singeing the trees, one sees the foreshadowing of martial law. As a child, I sat in my Western living room and watched the Molotov cocktails fly behind the iron drape. Back then, no one thought to explain to me how walls against the flight of capital might end in flames, how on TV I was witnessing soldiers clip the wings of the very same paper birds that here flew all around me. And this next poem is about a dream I had where my mother and I were in this warscape trying to find Indian food to eat, or Indian. It's called That Must Be a Duck. The Indian food was mediocre, but I thought it only right that we too should feel the effects of war. I had been very influenced by Russia and often fell asleep thinking of Ivan and his brothers, of smoked eel and of oligarchs. Come, I told my mother, I know where the coffee is still good. Our bicycles were hidden behind a snowbank guarded by peasants. My mother gave them a $10 bill, then said, when the machine breaks, we break. They held it to the light. At the edge of the city, in the clearest of water, we found the dogs that had adapted. They swam deep using their wings as fins. One broke through the surface. Look, Ma, they've mastered land, sea, air. No, that's not possible. That must be a duck, she insisted. But Ma, I said, pointing, look, his face, a terrier. It's all true. We found ourselves. Do I want to do this one? Yes. Okay. We found ourselves in reading, then closed the book. That was all it took, one pesky minute adrift in the mind at bedtime. Awake there, I didn't sleep, naked and unconsoled. Why did God always insist on using brains to store unwanted soundtracks? I stretched my legs, walked the dog, and still truth wouldn't fall out of my ear. It gave me a stiff neck and a strange gait. As unhappy as a bird in snow, I sat down to plan at the kitchen table with the formica at my elbows. My companion felt suddenly the seriousness of the problem. It was then easy to explain. Getting to go where you aren't, where you never will be, that's what airplanes are all about, I began. Nescafe, diesel fumes, Nietzsche's typewriter behind a pane of glass. How wonderful it will be to stay where we can never live. She clearly understood. And only a short walk from the S-Bahn station, I noted, the lovers are buried through the woods, interred where they fell by the lake. With this detail, she packed her trunks. We admired the shapes of foreign spoons, the slightly different cut of shirt worn by men over 50. Had we the chance, we would have even found an Italian railroad yard worthy of our attention. And when an elderly Danish woman at the next table inquired finally how it was that our countrymen were so stupid, I can only note that historically our army's firing lines have been circular. All right, so then I'll just read one pandemic poem, and then I'll end with a short poem by Miron Białaszewski. The commune is spinning. Fungus weaves its way into sinking aspirations of self-reliance. Leaves struggle, worms bore, grubs grub. Thou art a heavy feeder prone to disease, weeping over figs that hang like dry paps. When every there has slipped away, I govern the occurrences of the house. I am holding a book I will not read. Full of itself, my hunger has no need and keeps needing to speak with a flowering world. Words are maybe perfect space, ubiquitous as light, and I a dreamer in some lavish empty, enveloped in the vaporous hand of their sound. I did feel her mouth, it was as real as that stone on the shelf. I knew her phrases to be a marsh, soft openings to swaddle the bones of my several selves. So this next poem is from Białaszewski's, I think, second collection, if I remember correctly. And it's just a translation I tried last fall in Warsaw. Where is it? And I like it because he's always making fun of, or he's not making fun of, his imagination is filled with all these Catholic images and stories, and he's always going to church, but he's not religious. So, in this poem, is called "It's Hard Not to Levitate," a Carmelite rumor. Avoid people he did, but they struck from both sides of the parlor. A doctor with a mystical lady doctor. John of the Cross sat, Teresa of Avila knelt, a nun came, knock, knock, nothing. A little later, knock, knock, she enters. They're hanging from both sides of the ceiling. Come and confirm, sisters! They came and saw, they're hanging. They couldn't take it. Mother, how can this be? Later, M. Teresa with a little smile. Well, when one is speaking with Brother John, it's difficult to resist levitation. It was also difficult for him not to levitate. He held onto the chair, couldn't take the chair. He didn't write any of this down. They haven't seen each other since. They have exchanged letters. Thank you. We have 30 seconds for questions.
Randy, what was the book you were reading? Your book?
Oh, The Tiniest Muzzle Sings Songs of Freedom. I can really sneaky about it. I'm back. All right, should we break?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, thank you so much.
Tell us what you have.